Hey everyone, welcome back to Altengrad City in City Skylines. Today we are going to focus on industry as we already built the big residential district last time for all the new workers. The new factories will be right here on the side of the existing industrial zone. It will also include a functional railway cargo station, and we will upgrade some public transport infrastructure among other things. But first, for the historical introduction. Together with industrialization of the communist countries of Central Europe, we should also mention nationalization and central planning, as it is all tied together and those are all very important topics, even relevant to city development. Let's start with the nationalization. In general, the word means that the state takes over something that previously had a private owner. The opposite of that would be privatization. Nationalization is not specific only to communist or authoritarian regimes. It is a tool used throughout history and even today. Probably the most common use today is when acquiring land to build large infrastructure projects, but there are, of course, many more cases. The Central European countries nationalized differently, so it's difficult to generalize again. Without going into too much details, there were, for example, waves of nationalizations right after the Second World War, even before communists gained total power in some countries. These were, for example, outside of Germany, businesses owned by convicted collaborators or German citizens who were forced to leave the countries. Other waves happened with communism with varying scales. The most successful were the communists in Czechoslovakia, where by the late 1950s they managed to erase all private businesses of any size in any field, as they were directly outlawed. In other countries, some significant numbers of small businesses remained, like craftsmen, pub owners, and so on. In East Germany, for example, the wave of nationalization of small businesses occurred even much later in early 1970s. In agriculture, we talk about collectivization instead, where the farmer joins a farming co-op, which theoretically doesn't need to be run by the state. But in practice, it didn't differ from nationalization that much, since the farmers were forced into the co-ops and their assets were redistributed inside of it. The road to collectivization was again different in different countries, and for example in Poland it even failed and majority of farmlands remained in private hands. Not all farmland was of course used for farming. Some of it was nationalized for the purpose of building huge factories in the middle of nowhere, building new cities like we introduced it in the last episode with socialist realism, or simply expanding the existing cities. This is one of the reasons why such large projects were even possible in those times. Overall, nationalization of businesses and collectivization of farms had varying levels of popular support. The latter was usually met with great opposition in the countryside, while the former was sometimes even viewed positively by the city masses, especially those not affected, of course. People whose businesses were nationalized were then still working there. To paraphrase one East German family business owner, one day he was an undesirable capitalist and the next day he was a director of socialist labor. You can of course imagine what kind of effect this had on people's morale and working efficiency. Compensation for the nationalized assets was mostly none or very low and or very difficult to obtain, obstructed by some intentionally difficult bureaucracy. Nationalization also led to big reorganization of businesses. We already touched the subject with public transportation, but it was similar in other areas. Smaller businesses doing similar things were merged together, or large businesses doing many different things were divided and merged with other divisions that did similar things, depending on the individual decisions of the planning committees. This is called a horizontal division, which should have prevented the fragmentation of industry, meaning that now only a handful of companies, sometimes even just one, was responsible for one product type. But it also brought many negatives. The large state-run companies had, most of the time, or at least in their regions, complete monopolies and had very little economic motivation to be profitable, to innovate, or provide the best possible quality, since their place on the market and even their existence of jobs, was assured by the state. But this, of course, didn't mean that the managers could just lay down and stop doing anything. They needed to meet the plans created by the central planners. Some companies' directors and managers wanted to make good names for themselves and the companies they ran, so they did care, but there were also the exact opposite, who did the bare minimum. The reorganization also broke already working supply and manufacturing chains and overall business relations, which further worsened the company's effectiveness. Workers' morale was also not the greatest due to various reasons, for example, low wages of highly skilled workers, poor utilization of work, and so on. And last but not least, people's political backgrounds played a big role in hiring processes, especially in higher administrative and management roles, which filtered out some better qualified candidates. This was especially strict in the late 40s and early 50s during the Stalinist times. All of those specifics were present throughout the communist decades, and we will return to these many more times when talking about especially the construction industry, since it directly affected the looks of some places in cities. Now for the topic of central planning. Just like nationalization, it doesn't need to be only specific to communist or authoritarian regimes, and it can also have many different levels and forms. Countries can, for example, have a war central planning, which even the United States had during the Second World War. In general, state central planned economy relies on the government to define what to make or build, where, by who, in what quantities, and for how much. This should theoretically lead to more efficient production, allocation of resources, and so on. But in the real world of the socialist Central European countries, central planning faced many challenges, most of which it couldn't overcome, and many of which were caused by the nature of the regimes, ideology, corruption, or even the ties to the Soviet Union. The challenges included the inability to correctly identify the needs of the buyers, to reasonably quickly react to changes in demand, technologies, trends, and react to certain crises and unexpected events, and simply overall realities of life and the world. A problem was also the inability to gather accurate information about the true states of the economies, or, for example, the manufacturing processes and their requirements. On the other hand, central planners could simply decide that certain sectors or projects will receive significantly more direct funding than others to artificially boost them without waiting for that sector to evolve on its own. This was another one of those reasons that very big projects could have been built relatively quickly. But this, of course, means that significantly lower funds went elsewhere. This leads us to industry and massive expansion of heavy industry after the Second World War. This included mining of resources, metallurgy, energy production, weapons, chemical and machinery manufacturing. The investments into these sectors were so large that some communist countries briefly overtook some of the Western countries in GDP growth in the late 1940s and early 50s. Although this was outweighed by the relatively low budgets for other sectors, which lowered the overall quality of life of the population. The orientation towards heavy industry was in some sectors done following a pressure from the Soviet Union. For example, weapons manufacturing, related chemical industry, or uranium mining. Overall, the effects these policies had on the looks of cities were clearly visible. The existing industry in cities was significantly expanded, factories damaged during the war were restored, and new gigantic industrial areas were built outside of cities, sometimes even together with new cities, like we already talked about it. This created demand for other things. It sped up the trend of people moving into cities, sometimes even fleeing collectivization, so the housing crisis deepened, and just the socialist realism projects were not enough to fix that. Infrastructure demands rose as well. Railway was the absolute dominant way to transfer cargo, so it received the necessary attention, as well as passenger transportation for workers. Road infrastructure needed to be fixed, upgraded, or built anew, but those are topics for some future videos and future decades. Right now, I think this could be enough for the industrial context, so let's move into city skylines and see what we're building. So the first thing that I did in the time-lapse, you could have seen me prepare that office building. Now, it's a very important structure. It's going to be in the center of this entire industrial area. It's going to serve as some sort of a main plant administration, and also it's going to be the main entrance into the entire zone, because in front of that building I'm planning like a little square with some public transportation, well, actually quite heavy public transportation, so that it is going to be the first thing that people will see when they get off the trams and buses. Now, this particular office building is the Miyagi Motors Administration Building or something like that. It's part of the Miyagi Motors, factories. It's made by Avania, if I'm not mistaken. It's been in the workshop for years already. I've been using that in Rockdale a long, long time ago. But it's a great looking building, great looking pack, so I highly recommend it. But I wanted to just slightly change it so that it would be looking similar to some of the more modern looking structures that you might see around Central Europe during the late 1950s, because socialist realism was no longer the required architectural style, so architects could start doing something that they did previously or start doing something completely new. I don't really want to go into details about architecture here because this is industrial video, but don't worry, we are going to touch that subject sometime else. All right, so that's the office building. Now, I also slightly upgraded the facade because, like I said, I just want to have it look slightly similar to some of the buildings that you might see in real life. And I think it does look like, some kind of buildings that I took inspiration from. Now, anyway, that's the office building. We are going to see it later because I'm going to build that square in front of it like I mentioned. The next thing that I did is I just put some random selection of industrial buildings all around this area. So I, for example, used some of the Miyagi Motors factory floors as well from the same pack as the office building, and then I just recycled some other factory buildings because, they look generic enough so that I can afford to do that. I also built a train station, but I would like to mention that later because now I want to focus on this place in front of this office building. So it was very important to me to somehow break the geometry of the entire area with this square and with the office administration. So I made it slightly angled like that, and it's actually angled perpendicular to that factory floor nearby. You can see it on the left there maybe, and it's just creating something interesting, something different in this place, spicing it up. But this is technically probably one of the most challenging things you can do with networks in city skylines. These kinds of intersections, these kinds of very complicated yet very small connections. So this tram loop, there already was a tram loop in this place, but I decided that I'm going to rework it, make it tiny bit bigger with a bit more favorable angles and radii leaving the main street. It's not exactly necessary from historical point of view to rework that tram loop. I probably should not have reworked it actually, but I kind of needed to because otherwise I would not be able to build it, right? Technical limitations of the game basically. But anyways, I still decided that I'm going to use probably the most complicated method of creating these intersections, and that is going completely nodeless. Now, what does that mean? So these intersections, for example, this one that I'm doing in here, this is basically the output road from like a planned bus terminal area or bus station area, small bus station area, and the tram loop going into the main street. And of course, the main street is not a single network, but it's made of 3 different networks, 2 ways for the road and center for the tram. So you can imagine that it's a very complicated connection for, the mechanics of the game and how it connects networks together. So it's all going to be completely mangled, and cars and trams are just going to slow down on the intersections. People are going to walk all around, and it's just going to be such a huge mess. So I decided to just completely ditch all of that and make it nodeless with the node controller. This is just not going to create that node at all. You have to kind of push the network segments away from the node, and you're just going to have the void of the map, there where the node was supposed to be. And you have to reconstruct it. You have to put the ploppable asphalt on the surface, and you have to construct the curbs again. So these days, it's not really that big of a deal because we have network curbs. Back in the day, if you had to do it with props, it was a lot more pain involved in that. But back in the day, you did not have node controllers, so you couldn't even do it. But the results are definitely worth it because vehicles are going to go perfectly smooth through this entire intersection, trams included as well. And, you can always paint it with the intersection marking tools as well. And it's just looking great. And most of all, it's performing great. So that's exactly why I decided to do this. But it's not definitely something I'm going to do everywhere in the city because it really does take some time. But with these kinds of complicated intersections, there's no other way. You can see that some of those connecting points really have a lot of roads going into them. So there's, for example, that like a U-turn option there for buses if they want to go into that bus station. And overall, it's just a huge headache to deal with this. So let's just go completely nodeless and detail it later. All right, enough of that. So while I was explaining that, we also finished that bus station. So with this bus station, I did pretty much exactly the same thing as with that bigger bus terminal in that, dedicated episode for the buses. So used the curbless roads and also used the variants of the curbless roads that don't have the curb only on one side, on the inner side of the bus area, so that I could just cover it with ploppable asphalt like this and have like a nice open space, like a parking space for buses and cars and, whatever else. So we only have, I think, 2 or 3 platforms in there for the buses, or 2 or 3 stops. Later, I'm just going to put some like fake looking, the stop markers so that it appears that we have a bit more than that. But functionally, we are going to have, I think, only 2 of them. And right now, only one of them is used because we have only one line going into this area. But I suppose that we could add some more lines into this place from some different places where trams don't go. That's not really going to be a problem. Also, the Miyagi Motors building, it already comes on one side of it with like a bare wall, which was absolutely perfect to put some kind of a mural on. I already did have some murals, like communist, worker symbols, and it was perfect to put it in this area. In the industrial zone, it really feels fitting. So that's where it is. I had to make it slightly brighter, but it really kind of stands out on that corner, but at the same time, not so much. So it just blends into the area very well. I really like it. I really like how that square or public transport stop area turned out to be. It's really good. It's really good. And by the way, also you could have seen me these days. It's so easy. I really cannot imagine going back to the old technique, doing these inserts, below the tram tracks. You can do that today with intersection marking tools automatically, and they are perfectly going to follow the tracks. Not like semi-accurately, but actually perfectly, which is amazing. So that really saved me a lot of time, and it made this place look just much cleaner. The wires are also really easy to do these days. As you can see, I just copy-pasted the tram tracks. I just moved them somewhere else, converted them into wires only, which is like a custom network that I built. I'm using it all the time, and just added a couple of nodes here and there with the network multi-tool, almost forgot the name, and just put it back. We're using Move It and holding Alt, so it perfectly snaps. So really, it's kind of amazing, because when I started Altengrad, all of these things, all of these wires and detailings, especially regarding trams, really around the trams, it was so painful to do all these things. But these days, it's just so easy with all the mods, with all the network multi-tools, intersection marking tools, and all those things. It's just so great. I'm really grateful that we have these, because these projects would be absolutely impossible. But anyway, we have more important things to talk about. For example, this train station. You are probably going to be interested in that as well. So this train station is something that's kind of inspired from various, industrial stations in real life. I really wanted to have an excuse to have train tracks running below those bridges over them, right? These kinds of industrial-looking bridges. So I really wanted to put that. By the way, I forgot to mention, and I really have to mention, I'm considering this factory to be like a railway factory, all right? Making trams, as you can see in here, and also some maybe train engines or wagons or things like that. So, that's why I'm putting all these props all around the place. Now, the cargo station, let's return to that, is actually functional, and let me explain how that works. So, I didn't record it, unfortunately, because I thought it's not really going to work, so I was just experimenting with it, but it did work, so I left it there. And what I did is I took a cargo train station, some kind of small cargo train station from the workshop. I don't think it really matters which one. And I changed its track into just a normal looking track, non-station track. I put it in the place so that the building is going to be inside of these factories, hidden, of course. And then I used move it with the alt function so that you can move networks that belong to the building, and I moved it into the correct position. And it actually works. And then I obviously connected it to all the outside world, and it does work. And I think that in these cinematics, you are going to see a train actually going into it. So, that's nice. And I really wanted to work on the functionality of this area. So I also wanted to have all the buses and vehicles and pedestrians use the place kind of realistically. So I also created lots of invisible pedestrian paths through the building, especially through that office building here, so that it appears as if people are going into it to kind of, check into work, for example, at the factory for their shifts. And the trams are just, using those intersections very nicely. And this is the cargo station and the cargo train that is just arriving into the entire area. And up here you can see all the vehicles leaving that hidden station building inside. And there is also like an underground road that is kind of my attempt to just cross connect the different factory buildings together. I also heavily played with the building spawn points so that there are only a couple of points where cargo is being delivered around the factory. So I really played around with gameplay as well in here, and it really paid off. The factory is actually, performing very well in terms of gameplay. We finally are having some actually medium to heavy cargo traffic around the city, so we are going to be forced to start fixing that as well. This place, for example, was the the entrance into the zone from the city side. There were a couple of places that needed to be renovated, so I just placed a couple of random random buildings, new buildings in here, but nothing much. As you can see, there are the new bus bays around that tram station, and bus bays were also placed a couple of places else in the entire zone, but that's nothing really all that important. This shot just shows the entire industrial zone, and I'm really satisfied with it. As you can see, there's that office building. It's not really super prominent. Maybe I could have made it a bit taller. Yeah, sure. At first I thought it would be a bit too intimidating and maybe not all that accurate for the late 50s, but here it is, and it's looking okay. I really like the scale of the industrial zone, finally. I'm not really saying that this is the final shape of the zone. We are probably going to touch it sometime else, but right now it's perfectly fine. Anyway, guys, so we are going to stay in the 1950s for one more episode because I have one more project in mind before we jump into the next decade. It's not really a project like super specific to 1950s, but I still would like to keep it there. So that's going to be for next time. Thank you for watching this episode of Altengrad. If you liked it, then you can do all the usual things to help it, help the video, help the channel, and that is clicking the thumbs up below the video, leaving a comment, sharing the video, and subscribing if you are new here. Big thanks to all the channel members, the direct supporters of the channel. Thank you guys for your support. I really appreciate it. Take care and goodbye.